Hello, my name is Liv Kessler. I'm a third-year undergraduate student here at the Department of Government. I study history and politics. I sat down earlier this year with Phillips, emeritus professor here at the department. We talked about her career, her research interest. I started out by asking her about her early days at the LSE, particularly as director of the Gender Institute.
I came to LSE in '99 and the Gender Institute at the time, so I was the first professor of gender theory and director of the institute, and it was a very shoestring operation at the time. It had been formed very much as a result of the efforts of a number of scholars across LSE from various departments, international relations, law, geography, social policy, who'd been pressuring LSE to set up a specific centre for gender research and gender teaching. So at the time that I was there, it was still very heavily dependent on the generosity of scholars across the school who provided many of the lectures for the core course that we had in a master's programme, and our master's students then chose very often options that were already being offered to students in other departments. I mean, it's now a very substantial Department of Gender Studies, the largest in Europe, and I don't really claim any particular credit for that because that happened over a long period. So, I mean, I think two things that were really really exciting about it. One is that it was of its nature very interdisciplinary in terms of what the students studied, but also the connections across the schools. So I really benefited from that because right from my start at LSE, I knew so many people in different departments across the school, which isn't, I think, always the case at LSE. And the other thing is, I mean, nobody goes to study gender with an idea that they're going to become very rich, you know? I mean, I know LSE has a bit of a reputation of attracting students who are very clever but also a bit instrumental about their studies, with an eye on, you know, the career in finance or management or whatever. The students that come to study gender either at master's level or at PhD, I mean, they're thinking of working in international rights organisations, NGOs, all very, very committed to studying and researching. So that was all very interesting. But I think, I mean, previously all my career previously had been in a politics department, and eventually I kind of missed being in a kind of a community of people who were more focused on politics. So after a number of years, I negotiated to take a joint appointment between gender and government.
Yeah, which is quite unique to you, actually. And I guess kind of, because I don't think it's a very common thing to have kind of joint, or maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it, I think, is also reflected in a lot of your research, that it has this kind of interdisciplinary and kind of, you know, joint political theory, political science, gender studies, nature to it.
Yes.
Which I guess is something important to you in your own research, no?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I've sort of, I suppose I think of myself as a feminist political theorist, right? So that kind of, just of its nature, it puts me between gender and government. Because
also when you started out in, you know, when you were doing your master's and your PhD, they weren't at all on gender studies. They were on
No. My PhD, in fact, was on colonial policy in British West Africa.
Yeah. So how was the path?
And when in my first job, I mean, I taught political theory. I'd done a philosophy and politics degree, and I taught political theory, but I also taught a course in African politics, a range of things. But I was kind of quite lucky. My first job, which was at City of London Polytechnic, was in fact the place which had the extraordinary archives, which are now the basis of the Women's Library at LSE.
Yeah.
So that was also part of my early teaching career, and I used to teach a course called The Rights of Women at City of London Polytechnic, where the students would all have to do an essay based on primary research in these archives. So, and then subsequently City Poly, which had become London Guildhall University, was looking for a new home where the archives could be expanded, and it ended up...
I've actually never been, but I've always been very curious about it.
It is really, really impressive library.
Because it's not... I think it used to be more open before COVID, and now they don't let as many people in. But anyways, I guess so I think there's definitely a fluidity in your research, and there's definitely been an evolution in the way you research your own research. At least I think there's an evolution in your PhD to where you ended up in the gender studies department. And I was wondering if you kind of wanted to talk more about kind of your own teaching and research, and especially kind of how your research interest had evolved. Maybe more particularly, we'll talk more about the specific interest a bit later, but more particularly kind of how teaching at LSE affected your research in some ways.
I think probably my research was much more affected by political debates going on outside the university. So the kinds of things that I've moved on from and that I've identified as crucial areas I wanted to do research on. I mean, obviously, if you do research, you're always influenced by your students because you teach a course and they ask questions that you hadn't thought about, and it prompts all kinds of things. But I think primarily, so for example, some of the major work that I did in the 1990s was around issues of democracy and political representation. So this was a time where, through the 80s and the 90s, it was a period in which there was a great deal of campaigning around trying to address the extraordinary underrepresentation of women in politics. Right. I mean, if you looked at the figures, you would find it really hard to believe. If you take the UK, women got the right to stand for Parliament in 1918. And then for the next 70 years, the proportion of women in Parliament would be 1%, 3%, 2%, 4%. I mean, just extraordinary underrepresentation. Yeah. And this was a pattern across Europe and the Americas. So it was a period in which there was a lot of organising going on about trying to address this. But there was a question that needed to be addressed, which is really, why does it matter? Yeah. So if you think about political representation, I mean, we vote for political parties and we vote on the basis of the ideas, the policies, the programmes. And so you could say, and lots of people did say, well, why should it matter whether the person who is your representative is male or female? Why should it matter whether the person is black or white? What you're voting for is particular ideas. And so it was kind of out of that I kind of came up with the idea of the thinking about representation in terms of both a politics of ideas and a politics of presence. Yeah. Presence being, it actually mattered to have present in the decision-making chambers people who represented the diversity of experience. And
to kind of build off on that, do you think that you seek out research that you think can be valuable or useful to kind of the way contemporary politics works? Do you think you seek out relevant issues that you can then that are useful to think about the way the world works, that are very contemporary, you kind of seek out these contemporary issues?
I think that's always what's driven my research, the idea that there are important political issues that throw up, because I'm a political theorist, that throw up areas of intellectual and political difficulty to try and work out what you think about them. In terms of what kind of impact one has, I think if you ask almost any academic, particularly in the social sciences, will have a dream of having a kind of an impact on the wider world, and it's one rarely knows whether one has a certain impact on one's students. One contributes to particular kind of political discourse. Hard to know what kind of impact, but certainly for me it's always been not so much kind of just puzzles in intellectual debates, but puzzles and problems that arise out of contemporary political debates.
Right. And so how would you, if you were to kind of give out categories to your work, how would you categorize in broad terms kind of how your career has evolved? What have been the main points that have driven you at different times in your career?
Well, I could say something about what I think are roughly 4 major areas of research, but they're all very interlinked in my mind. And I suppose I have a sense, both that they're all framed by an idea that methodologically I think of myself as a feminist political theorist, which to me carries with it certain kinds of ways of thinking about politics and certain critical challenges to, some of the assumptions within more mainstream political theory. But in terms of the topics, I think of all of my work in some way being linked to questions of equality and inequality. So I have the work on democracy and political representation, which I've said something about. I was already kind of in thinking about that. I wasn't just talking about the underrepresentation of women in politics, but thinking about the underrepresentation of people who were racialized minorities, but also thinking about how to think about the relationship between majority and minority linguistic and cultural communities. So that this was a time when there was a lot of discussion about multiculturalism, initially very much driven by some debates within Canada, people like Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka. And feminists had become quite troubled about multiculturalism. So I was very much, if you think about inequality and if you're worried about people being marginalised and excluded and underrepresented, you've got to think about the need to address the underrepresentation of cultural minorities as well as women, as well as people who are racialised minorities and so on. But once you start talking about multiculturalism, particularly once you start talking about the representation of cultural communities, there is a risk that you end up with the communities being represented by spokespeople who tend to be the older men in the community and who also may have a very strong commitment to what they see as their cultural traditions, even though many of the people within the community might not think that those are the traditions that they want to follow. And particularly you can have disagreements between young and old, between men and women. So feminists, a lot of feminists very, very troubled by multiculturalism because of feeling that it actually basically reinforced certain kinds of cultural traditions that were very much to the disadvantage of women, younger people, homosexuals. But also, if you're concerned about exclusion and marginalisation, you've got to, in some sense, be in favour of multiculturalism. So I then did quite a lot of work. So after the democracy and political representation, I then did quite a lot of work thinking about those tensions between feminism and multiculturalism.
And so that was kind of 2 out of 4.
Yes. So I suppose the third area, which was much more came out of teaching, is a book that I wrote on My Body, Whose Property, which came very directly out of the course that I've taught for a number of years on feminist political theory, where, again, it comes out of debates, the major debates among feminists, about how you think about issues like the commercialisation of sex or the commercialisation of reproduction, as in commercial surrogacy. And I suppose I'm more of a kind of generation of feminists who are critical of the way in which pornography, prostitution, commercial surrogacy, the ways in which these objectify women and sort of seem to turn women into bodies separate from people that can be bought and sold on the market. But increasingly in my classes of feminist political theory, a much stronger insistence by the students on, in a sense, one's individual rights to make one's own decisions about what one does with one's body.
I was going to bring up, I do feel like in contemporary political feminism kind of things, the rhetoric has a bit shifted.
Absolutely,
and it is different. And I think especially with kind of what happened in the US with Roe v. Wade being overturned, people have really thought differently about bodies and commodification and decisions, which is interesting kind of how, but I think that's one of those things where both are not necessarily wrong, but probably kind of look at the issue in different ways.
Very often there are very strong reasons to make the arguments on both sides. So anyway, I suppose in that kind of shift in feminism, and that between a kind of, in a sense, more of a kind of individualist, it's my body and I'm the one who can decide what to do with it, which might include deciding to, sort of sell my services as a surrogate mother or whatever it might be, against my own kind of sense that if you're a feminist, surely you're critical of the ways in which women become objectified and treated as just bodies. So I had a whole third area of trying to think about the issue about the body as property,
which feels very different from the multiculturalism work, which relates more to what you're doing now on kind of unconditional equals. That feels more of a kind of multiculturalism, equality. And so now you're kind of newest area.
I suppose the work on the body was me more grappling with the relationship between a kind of rights-based, very much more individual feminism, and how to think about that, and how to think about what was important about that, but at the same time what might be problematic about it. But the fourth area that I've worked on much more recently, which is the work about unconditional equals, which to me kind of, I suppose one always thinks this about one's most recent work, to me kind of brings together everything. Yes, right. Might not be seen by other people as doing that, but yes.
And so do you want to just explain briefly what this concept of unconditional equals means for you? And
right. So I think it starts from the extraordinary discrepancy is too small a word, contradiction, kind of dishonesty, in the ways in which, over the last 2-3 centuries, people have talked about equality as if, or the whole language of men are born equal, all men are created equals, and that this is coexisting with, first of all, it's all through this period, hardly anyone says, well, does that mean women are equal too? But also, this is the period in which there are people being enslaved. This is a period of colonization in which millions of people around the world are being subjected to colonial control. And you start thinking, well, what's going on in this language of equality, that people have this very strong notion of we are naturally equal, but they don't seem to see it as contradicted by all the kind of extraordinary exclusion of, in fact, the overwhelming majority of human beings. And I came to think that what's going on there is that the kind of, well, clearly one of the things that's going on there is the kind of ambiguities of the notion of nature, because as soon as you start talking about nature, something about our nature being what justifies us being equals, you're into all kinds of alibis for seeing some people as naturally inferior. And I think it continues into contemporary discourses in political theory, where whenever you hear people trying to say things like, well, what is it about us as humans that justifies treating us as equals? And actually what they're looking for is a kind of a condition, right? And as soon as you're thinking along those lines, in a way you're making the equality depend on demonstrating that you have this quality. And there's all, the people, what political theorists talk about, they talk about rationality, they talk about moral agency, they talk about particular kind of cognitive abilities. But once you say that these are the reasons why we should regard other people as equals, actually what you're saying, by implication, is that if people didn't have these, if they fell short of these, there'd be no reason at all to regard them as equals. So it becomes part of an argument that I just think we really have to get away from that idea that equality is conditional on anything about us as humans, other than the most basic fact that we're humans. Right. No. So an unconditional equality.
I very much like in a lot of past interviews the mention of prisoners as an example, especially in the US, like being removed their right to vote, and therefore, the idea that goodness or even the idea of immigration and like the good immigrant or something like this idea that goodness equals humanity, but badness equals non-humanity.
No, I mean, it is extraordinary about the voting rights of prisoners, because we tend to think of the equal right to vote, all adults, equal right to vote, all citizens, the equal right to vote. We tend to think that as the most basic expression of our supposed equality. And yet that is taken away, in the UK it's taken away from convicted prisoners.
Oh, really?
Not in many other parts of Europe. And in the US, as you know, in some states you would lose your right to vote for life. So it's like saying the fact that you're human, that only gets you so far. You've actually got to be a good human as well in order to qualify for what we had been taught was the basic expression of our equality.
Yeah, and I guess kind of from past, but like the idea of goodness is so linked to whatever era that you're living in, like the idea of that. I think a lot of your research touches upon this conception that we can't really rely on ourselves to be objective measurers of anything, because so that's something I was kind of wondering about your work. Is there this idea that like there's a hypocrisy that is inscribed in these kind of Declaration of Human Rights, and that, you know, they say equal for all, but really they're like, we're saying this, but we really don't mean it? Or is it that they genuinely believe in an equality for all and can't even fathom that they're not giving it?
I think very often it is the second. I mean, and that's in a way the more extraordinary thing, that the kind of that the way in which one can simply be incapable of seeing that when you say, you know, all beings are created equal, all humans are created equal, that it's entirely inconsistent with
Your behaviour.
with kind of refusing the vote to women, or with establishing a colonial empire. I mean, so I think in a way, I think there is hypocrisy, there is dishonesty, but I think there's also, I mean, in a way, the more challenging aspect of it all is the way in which people are unable to see certain things. It's true of us, undoubtedly, you know, and in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time, people will look at the things we've written and we've argued and sort of shake their heads and think, how could they not have realised that? So I do think there's a sense in which we're all of us, to some extent, captives of our period in history, but I do not ever think that excuses.
Yeah.
You know, that doesn't mean that somehow you're not in a position where you can criticise the failings of people.
I guess there is this idea of like we can't really trust ourselves to be impartial judges because we don't know the biases that we're carrying with us right now.
Well, we can do the best we can to try and make sense of them and to understand what's going on and to challenge them. But I think it goes back to some of what I think is so important about ensuring that political representation really does capture the range of the population, the electorate that it's supposed to be representing, because you need to be challenged by people who have different experiences. You need to be challenged by people who have different knowledges, because that's part of the process in which you do contest your own or begin to recognise your own biases and your own presumptions that derive, you know, we read, of course, and you wouldn't be in the business of education if you didn't think that people can change through reading things, but we also derive a huge amount of our thinking about things from experience, and that can impose various kinds of shutters.
Yeah, and so how would you say, do you have like a next project that you're working on at the moment that kind of follows through in this idea of unconditional equals, or is it kind of a departure from it? What are you working on next, if you are working on anything?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment I'm doing something which is more of a follow-through, and I mean, I think it's something that, I mean, it's come up in a number of things that I've written over recent years, but I'm trying to think about putting it all together, which is around the languages of equality, and how much I'm struck by how difficult we seem to find it to come up with a language in which to express equality without it already introducing a certain kind of hierarchy. So I'm thinking of things like, you know, if you talk about the importance of recognising others as your equals, and actually, if you think about the way that works somehow, recognising, I recognise others as my equals. Actually, what it sounds like is you're completely secure in your own position as an equal.
I'm an equal.
But I now recognise that you too are my equal. There's something about that kind of formulation that contradicts what it's supposed to be saying, which is equality.
Concepts of the self as well, I guess.
And I think there's a lot of there's a lot of difficulty in the way in which people different ways in which people formulate equality that somehow convey something other than equality. And I'm quite compelled to just sort of think through some of those things, and I suppose come up with what I think is a good language for it. But
Yeah.
whether I'll manage that, I don't know.
Because I think also, you can tell me if it's criticism, but something that's been brought up about the language you use to define equality is also very linked to humanness and being a human, which is interesting because it does presuppose, contradict me, but like a hierarchy between humans and animals, or say, how do we consider the natural world? And perhaps this is also kind of something of, the 21st century, and thinking about the natural world as something that's very perishable and kind of coming out of our grasp because of our own undoings and our own conceptions of hierarchies between us and the natural world. And so how do you kind of inscribe that? It's a slightly different tangent from the unconditional equals.
No, it's an issue that many people raise. I like to think that what I'm arguing is not about hierarchy between humans and non-human animals, but that what I'm saying is that the notion of equality between, is something that it comes very much out of a human history. It's something that humans have kind of come up with as a kind of, as a commitment that they make to one another. And it seems to me it's not something which fits well with our obligations to the natural world or the world of animals. So I'm not at all saying that we should treat animals as, they're outside the scope of equality and therefore we can do whatever we like with them, and that therefore they're objects that we can just, make use of for our satisfaction and so on. But I think equality is not the appropriate language for the relationship between humans and animals. I think the obligations that we have to non-human animals and the obligations that we have to the natural world, it's a different kind of ethics and a different set of obligations. But it is true, and it's one of the worries that people have about my argument, that it does seem to have quite a sharp. It's making no distinctions among humans. We're all equals, however good or bad we are. But it is drawing a line between human and non-human animals. And, and that's obviously an area of continuing discussion.
Keep thinking about throughout your research, I guess. But, I was kind of, to come back to these issues of political spheres and multiculturalism and polarization, I feel like these have been very relevant issues recently with things like Brexit. And I was wondering, how these ideas of multiculturalism and polarization, do you feel like these have been ideas that you've been able to apply to the current situation and almost in a sense kind of anticipate, which is interesting. And so how would you consider your work useful to these kind of day-to-day political debates that we're seeing unfold all the time?
Yes, yeah. I think one part of the it's a link between both my feminism and my position on multiculturalism. I'm very sceptical of the way that identities are imposed on people and the way that identities become constraints on people. So I'm quite sceptical of ideas of national identity, right? When people sort of make these generalizations about, the French or, the English or, I cringe because I just do not think that has much meaning. And partly it doesn't have much meaning because these kind of national identities, they're actually composed of people who are differentiated. Their lives are different in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of region, in terms of whether you live in the city or in the country, that a lot of the generalizations that are made about national identity really don't work. So that's been a theme both in my thinking about what do you mean by culture? What do you mean by being a woman? What do you mean by being a man? All of these things they're attempts to sort of simplify really complex and varied and shifting identities into some neat little categories. So in that sense, I'm I mean, I think it's been very troubling how across Britain certainly, but also across Europe, that there's been quite a revival of what seems like very strong kinds of nationalisms in ways that I find very troubling.
No, I can imagine. And to kind of, on a slightly different tangent, but to come back to this idea of ascribing people to very specific kind of, you are a woman and you are a woman of colour, I think it's really interesting in the language to kind of briefly comment on our President, Vice-Chancellor's, I wouldn't call it resignation, but, Minouche Shafik kind of leaving LSE in the summer. I think that the language surrounding her as a director has been very tied to her gender, very tied to her ethnicity, and more so almost than her other achievements, which I found very interesting in the treatment of her as director. Because she's, I mean, I don't know if you would like to comment on this as an idea of like how we view women in power and how we kind of treat, especially women, I think, in education and power that have had a long career.
Yeah, no, it's still very much. I hadn't particularly noticed it with Minouche, but what you say about people kind of seeing her very much as she is the first. Well, she's not the first, but she's a woman director of LSE. But it is undoubtedly the case that one of the continuing features of our cultural context is that everyone notices that women are women, but don't seem to notice that men are men, so that the kind of men become the norm, in which you don't even comment on the fact that that a man is in a position of power and influence. But if a woman is in a position of power and influence, then that's very much the case. I noticed that the woman who just previously has just finished her period of office as Chancellor, or whatever they call it, the kind of top person at Oxford, and is now being succeeded by a woman, right? And she says that it's always been her ambition in life that if she has a position of power, that what she regards as success is not her being appointed to that position, but when the next person who occupies the post is also a woman, that in a way it's become normalised that people in those positions would be women, rather than we've had our woman and now we can go back to the norm. Yeah,
which I think is a weirdly kind of reoccurring pattern in like politics or something, where you're like, oh no, but we elected a woman last time.
We've done
so
that,
that's enough. But I do think that as a very multicultural space, LSE is an interesting example of many different people from many different parts of the world coming together, and I do think it really changes the way you perceive the world and education when you're surrounded by just so many people. So I guess there is an argument to be made in favor of having so many different people from so many different places kind of together. I guess your problem with it is more that it becomes their identity, the fact that they are...
No, I mean, I think the diversity is precisely one of the things that helps to dissolve those very strong notions of identity. I mean, it's one of the reasons why living in London is such a kind of interesting and exciting place.
It is.
One gets tired of it after a while, but because of the hustle and the bustle. But you just know, you know that you can't fall back on simple labels about people, and I think that's one of the effects of living in much greater diversity. So whether it's London as a city or LSE as a university, I think it has that effect.
In kind of recent news, I think LSE has also kind of detached itself from the LGBTQ plus organisation Stonewall, which I found a very interesting development, knowing that LSE is such a diverse kind of institution that is so committed to its diversity. And so I kind of still wonder, why would you do something like that? I think is an interesting kind of stance in this day and age.
Yes, no, I mean there have been a lot of disagreements about Stonewall being seen as pursuing specific kinds of policies, which some people see as a kind of a narrowing of their remit. But the thing that really strikes me about the decision at LSE is that it seems that it was taken with no consultation with the kind of the groups within LSE that represent the LGBTQ communities. and also without putting in place any alternative mechanism for ensuring that discrimination doesn't occur. So, but I mean, I haven't been. I mean, I retired in September, so I haven't been following everything in detail. Yes, but I did notice that, and as you say, sort of a bit disturbing that it comes as an announcement rather than as something that is actually debated and discussed and then decided.
Yeah, it should be. What are your kind of perspectives looking back at your career, the changes that LSE has gone through since the beginning of your career to your retirement? How would you kind of qualify those changes?
Well, I think higher education in Britain in general has changed, and I have to say I would relate it to the point at which the government stopped direct funding of universities and switched to student fees and very high student fees. And I think that universities in general and LSE, less than some, but also LSE, it becomes more corporate in its management style. And of course, students become more like customers rather than students. When I joined LSE in '99, the amazing thing about it was the sense that this was a working democracy, and the sense that the really big decisions were taken by the staff in academic board, and it just felt like something of the old principles of the original LSE were still there. And it's not that the institutions within LSE have changed really radically since then, but I do think that there's a less democratic style of decision making, as in the example that you just gave about the decision about Stonewall. So I do think, on the other hand, I mean, if you go higher education as a whole, all the casualisation of teaching,
the strikes,
which in some universities, it's almost half of the teaching is done by casual part-time workers, who are kind of dealing with the very large influx of student numbers. LSE, to its credit, has largely resisted that. So, I mean, LSE's held on to a lot of the what I see as the older kind of principles and practices of universities, but definitely higher education has shifted in the 45 years, not surprisingly, in which I've been an academic.
And for LSE particularly, I guess there's also been a shift in terms, in terms of the proportion of international students. It's always been an international university, but I think the proportions are much higher now than they used to be.
Yes. And I mean, I think, ideally you need a good balance between home students and international students. And I worry about the potential decline in students from Europe, obviously, since Brexit. What you would ideally like is a university which has students from all over the world, but in which no one group of students becomes too dominant. And
kind of pushing on with this idea of students, do you personally feel like you have any advice to give to either prospective students who are studying at A-levels or equivalent, and also to students at a soon-to-be master's level or postgraduate level in general, in in academia, in research?
Well, I think I would just say, to try to kind of follow your own interests, right? I mean, it was what I always used to say to my undergraduate students at LSE when I had them as mentees, and they're trying to decide which courses to choose and what options to take. Take the ones that most interest you. Go with what most interests you, because that's where you'll do best anyway. But also, what is the point of study? What is the point of research, unless it's actually enabling you to think about and research in the areas that really matter to you. So, I mean, that would be.
And it sounds like very basic advice, but it
Yeah,
isn't,
yeah.
because a lot of people just choose very strategically and then find themselves being very, very bored or very, very uninterested.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, well, thank you so much
Well,
for
thank
talking
you. Thank
to
you
me.
very much.
Yeah, it was wonderful.